Not only did he teach them a great many things, but a great many things happen in today's relatively short gospel. But in the midst of these great many things, Jesus gives one very important teaching, which in many ways constitutes a command. It's mentioned toward the beginning, and it would seem almost to kind of be blown off as a side comment. But it is, in fact, a very important command that we receive. And that is, come away by yourselves to a deserted place and rest. Now we might think, how important could that be? But when you really think about it, that is one of the 10 commandments. Now hopefully we know the 10 commandments, and in many cases we know the commandment itself, but not always do we know the lines and the verses that follow each commandment. And some of them have a variation of what follows them, such as a promise that is attached to a particular commandment, or an assurance that if this commandment is broken, it will not go unpunished. But with the commandment, keep holy the Sabbath day, it has with it an instruction on just how we are to keep it, to what extent we are to keep it. Now, as Christians, we don't keep holy the Sabbath day, the seventh day. We keep holy the Lord's day, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. But what is the rest of that commandment? Jesus goes on to say, not you, nor your servants or your slaves. Now, on the one hand, in our modern, overly sensitive, politically correct groupthink mindset, we might be shocked. But yes, there were slaves in Israel. But what is this commandment telling us? Unlike any other nation that had slaves, they were to take one day in which even the slave is raised to an equal dignity with their masters, in that everyone must take a day of rest. And not only them, but any foreign guests they might have with them. So this is not just a commandment for the Jewish people, but for all the people, a universal command to take a day of rest. And not only people, but the commandment goes on. Not even your ox or your ass or any beast of burden may work on that day. So think about that. God was the very first animal rights activist, which even the beasts of burden are commanded to be included in taking a day of rest. 6 days of the week you may work, but on the seventh day you must rest. And it is more than just a command. It is, for His people, a tremendous gift. Because when did He give this command? He gave this command after He had liberated the Hebrews from their slavery in Egypt. And He said, no longer are you slaves for an oppressive king, but your work will be yours. He lifts up work to that human dignity it is meant to be. He says you will work on your own land, sow and reap your own crops, rest under your own fig tree. But at the same time, He reminds us, we are nonetheless not slaves to our work, so consumed with our work that we become slaves to work itself. We must take a day of rest. So with that great gift that reminds us that we are people of freedom and not slavery, He also gives us a command that we are not to be enslaved by our work, but use that day as a day of rest. And what do we do as a part of that day of rest? From the Hebrew people who received that command to Jesus Himself who gives it to us in today's gospel, to we who hear that command again. It is in the context of this day of rest that we come to worship God. A small portion of that day dedicated to the worship of God. In other words, when we come to worship God, it must be in the context of rest. Now, perhaps many of us know a number of people, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, in our church, where we know of people who do not practice their faith in terms of coming to Mass to worship God on Sunday. And more often than not, what is usually the excuse for it? All one has to do is ask the children. They say it. And if you know the children are saying it, the parents are saying it. What do they say? We're just too busy. Well, think about it. They're too busy to take a day of rest. But perhaps even in that context of people who do come and celebrate the Mass on Sunday, what is the disposition of some? I know I make a point never to wear a wristwatch whenever I'm celebrating Mass, because there's always the temptation to look at our watches throughout. And why? Is Mass going to get out on time? Is the homily too long? Are things going too slow? I have other things I must get to. We have those who think nothing of arriving late, sometimes very late, and even leaving early, because there are other things they want to get to. We have, in our cultural context, a mindset of always being busy. And for some, it's a question perhaps we could ask. Are we here marking time, fulfilling an obligation, getting it over with so that we can get on to the next event? Or are we worshiping God in the context of a day of rest that we are not only invited to take, but we are in fact commanded to take? And not just merely as a command, but as a tremendous gift that God gives us. And so Jesus reminds us today, in a gospel in which a lot is happening, and the apostles are coming back to him after doing a lot of things, after coming back from the mission that Jesus had given them. They come and report to him everything they had done, and Jesus tells them, now let's take some time, kick back, put your feet up, and rest a while. And we are called to do the same as people of faith. Our work is part of what gives us our dignity, but we are not slaves to that work. We are called to be people of true freedom, in which in the midst of our busyness, we take time out and rest. And it is in the context of that rest that we come to worship Almighty God, and give just a portion of that day of rest to the worship of God. And that is why we are here today. So let us be renewed in that as we come to take our rest in the presence of God, as we give him worship, as we receive the body and blood of his Son, that we truly and more fully work into our lives that basic command that Jesus gives us in today's gospel, which harkens back to commandments so important that it is included among the 10. And that is very simply, come away and take some time to rest.